21 Golden Era celebrities who weren't as smart as we thought. Brilliance, genius, intellectual prowess, these are qualities we've been led to associate with certain stars of Hollywood's golden age. The sophisticated gentleman with perfect diction discussing philosophy between takes. The aristocratic actress quoting Shakespeare while sipping tea. The worldly director revolutionizing cinema with his unprecedented intellect. These images have been etched into our collective memory of classic Hollywood. But what if I told you that some of cinema's most celebrated intellectuals were actually far simpler than their carefully crafted public images suggested? That's right, 21 beloved icons from Hollywood's most glamorous era were marketed as brilliant minds, Renaissance people, and cultural sophisticates when the reality was often startlingly different. Today we're pulling back the curtain on one of Hollywood's most persistent illusions, the manufactured intellectual. From the actor whose sophisticated accent masked a limited education to the director whose genius relied heavily on uncredited collaborators, these stories reveal the gap between Hollywood mythology and reality. We'll discover how publicity departments transformed ordinary performers into apparent geniuses, how studios created false narratives about stars' academic achievements, and how some celebrities themselves perpetuated myths about their intellectual prowess. This isn't about exposing these stars or diminishing their talents. Rather, it's about understanding the powerful image-making machine that created the personas we still admire today. In many ways, these performers' ability to embody intellectual sophistication they didn't naturally possess demonstrates their remarkable skills as actors, both on and off screen. So join us as we explore 21 Golden Age celebrities who weren't quite as smart as we were led to believe. Their stories reveal much about Hollywood's dream factory, the power of perception, and our own desire to believe in the extraordinary intelligence of those who entertain us. Before we dive into our countdown, let's understand how Hollywood's star-making system worked during its golden era. Studios didn't just create movies, they created mythologies around their talent. These weren't simple publicity campaigns, they were comprehensive identity transformations designed to elevate ordinary people into extraordinary figures worthy of public adoration. In an era before television and social media, when most Americans had limited access to higher education, intellectual sophistication carried a special allure. Studios recognized that audiences were drawn to performers who seemed not just beautiful or talented, but intellectually superior. This created a powerful incentive to manufacture intellectual credentials for stars, particularly those from humble backgrounds. Publicity departments worked tirelessly to craft highbrow narratives, inventing prestigious educational backgrounds, arranging strategic photographs of stars reading classic literature, and coaching performers on how to discuss intellectual topics in interviews. Some studios even employed conversation coaches who taught actors appropriate cultural references and how to discuss art, literature, and politics without revealing their limited knowledge of these subjects. This wasn't just studio manipulation. Many performers actively participated in crafting these intellectual personas, recognizing that perceived sophistication translated directly to career advancement and longevity. Some went to extraordinary lengths to conceal their educational limitations, hiring private tutors to teach them proper pronunciation, etiquette, and cultural knowledge that their backgrounds hadn't provided. Now, let's count down from number 21 to number 1 and uncover the truth behind Hollywood's most celebrated intellectuals. Stars whose perceived brilliance was often more performance than reality. 21. Orson Welles, the boy genius who borrowed others' brilliance. Film schools still hail Orson Welles as a prodigy who transformed radio and cinema before turning 30, largely due to Citizen Kane, long regarded as a cinematic masterpiece. Welles is often praised for his technical mastery and artistic vision, but much of his acclaim rests on the uncredited work of others. Cinematographer Greg Toland pioneered the film's deep focus techniques, yet Welles took public credit. The screenplay, which won an Oscar, was mainly written by Herman J. Mankiewicz, though Welles tried to downplay his role. In a 1941 interview, Welles spoke at length about deep focus without mentioning Toland. A crew member later recalled Toland saying, "The boy's a quick study. He's already convinced himself he created what I showed him." A studio executive described Welles's talent as absorbing just enough from experts to sound authoritative. His intellectual image was similarly crafted. He could recite Shakespeare, but mostly quoted well-known lines from an anthology, not full texts. Welles's genius wasn't rooted in deep scholarship or originality, but in his flair for repackaging others' ideas with charisma and conviction, convincing audiences that brilliance originated solely from him. 20. Cary Grant, the sophisticated gentleman who left school at 14. Everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want want to be Cary Grant," the actor once said, hinting at a hidden truth. Cary Grant was a carefully crafted persona. Known for his elegance, charm, and flawless speech, Grant was widely believed to be naturally refined and well-educated. Studio biographies subtly reinforced this illusion, implying a privileged background without outright lying. In reality, Archibald Leach, Grant's birth name, was born into poverty in Bristol. He left school at 14, his father was an alcoholic, and his mother was institutionalized when he was 9. His refined accent was entirely self-made, blending British and American tones into something unique. Grant's transformation was deliberate. He kept vocabulary cards and annotated scripts with phonetic spellings to perfect pronunciation. A director once noted Grant had marked difficult words like intransigent and paradigm in a script. At a Hollywood literary event, when James Joyce's Ulysses came up, Grant quietly left the conversation and later asked a researcher for a summary and key quotes. Grant's brilliance lay not in innate sophistication, but in his relentless self-reinvention. "I pretended to be somebody I wanted to be," he said, "and finally I became that person. Or he became me." 19. Katharine Hepburn, the intellectual aristocrat, who calculated every move. Biographies often portray Katharine Hepburn as a brilliant intellectual, highlighting her Bryn Mawr education, eloquence, and thoughtful performances. Her bold rejection of Hollywood norms, summed up by her quote, "If you obey all the rules, you miss all the fun," helped cement her reputation as an independent cerebral force. But Hepburn's intellectual image was carefully constructed. While intelligent, she was more strategic than naturally scholarly. Her college transcripts show she was an average student with modest grades. A classmate noted, "Kate was bright but not exceptional academically. What set her apart was her drive to be exceptional." Behind the scenes, Hepburn prepared meticulously to appear effortlessly sharp. A 1940 studio memo noted she demanded interview questions in advance and time to study topics like literature or politics. Director George Cukor once found her rehearsing spontaneous opinions with Agatha Christie novels hidden inside covers of classic literature. Though she was articulate and educated, Hepburn's refined persona was not simply innate. It was the result of disciplined image building. Her legacy as an intellectual icon reflects both her genuine abilities and her commitment to appearing brilliant, even when it required careful orchestration. 18. Errol Flynn, the worldly adventurer who fabricated his exploits. The phrase "in like Flynn" became slang for effortless success, especially with women, but it also fits how seamlessly Errol Flynn's fabricated backstory entered public belief. Studio PR painted him as a real-life adventurer who prospected for gold, fought in wars, and explored unknown lands before turning to acting, making him seem tailor-made for roles like Captain Blood or Robin Hood. Flynn often claimed his father was a scientist, and that he spent his youth on wilderness expeditions in Tasmania. In truth, his father was a biology professor, and Flynn's expeditions were limited to suburban Hobart. His tales of New Guinea exploits, gold mining, and plantation management were exaggerated versions of short stints doing odd jobs. Official records show no evidence of mining claims or land ownership. A former classmate joked that Flynn would have needed to be triplets to have done all he claimed by age 20. Director Michael Curtis noted Flynn avoided deep character work, relying on charisma instead of preparation. His ghostwriter later admitted Flynn blurred fact and fiction so often, even he couldn't tell them apart. Flynn's globe-trotting persona was largely a Hollywood invention, fiction the actor helped write and the public happily believed. 17. Greta Garbo, the mysterious intellectual who avoided complex conversations. "I want to be alone." With that line, Greta Garbo became cinema's ultimate enigma. Critics often portrayed her silence as profound, painting her as a deeply intellectual recluse, but Garbo's famous solitude had more practical roots. A former assistant revealed that her limited English, not mystery, was the reason for her quietness. Garbo, with little formal education in Sweden, feared making grammatical errors in interviews. A 1932 MGM memo shows the studio hired a language coach to prepare her for press interactions, but Garbo avoided practice, choosing to speak as little as possible. Her private life also challenged the intellectual image. Though her apartment displayed a large book collection, a friend admitted most volumes were unread, with uncut pages. She liked the way they looked, the friend recalled. Photographer Cecil Beaton, a close acquaintance, noted in his diary that Garbo avoided abstract discussions, often changing the subject or leaving the room. At one dinner, asked about Nietzsche, she quipped, "I think it's time for dessert," retreating to browse a fashion book. She once told Lillian Gish, "The mystery is that people think I'm thinking anything interesting at all." Garbo's real genius was understanding that silence could be mistaken for depth. 16. William Powell, the urbane sophisticate with limited formal education. William Powell once said, "I'm just a run-of-the-mill person who got lucky," a modest claim that hid the truth behind his polished screen persona. Known for playing urbane, educated characters like Nick Charles in the Thin Man series, Powell's effortless sophistication fooled many into believing it was natural. In reality, Powell left school at 17 and never attended college. He learned upper-class manners by working as a waiter at the university club, quietly studying how educated men spoke and behaved. His on-screen refinement was the result of careful observation and practice. Studio records show Powell's dedication. His scripts were filled with notes on pronunciation, emphasis, and timing. Director W.S. Van Dyke revealed that Powell rehearsed details like how to hold a cocktail glass or light a cigarette to perfect his elegant image. During The Great Ziegfeld, Powell confessed to co-star Frank Morgan that he knew little about wine personally, memorizing sophisticated facts for his roles while preferring bourbon in real life. Powell's rise from high school dropout to Hollywood's symbol of polished masculinity remains one of the industry's most impressive reinventions, and his greatest act of all. 15. Joan Crawford, the self-made sophisticate who carefully concealed her limitations. Joan Crawford's Hollywood legend highlights her rise from chorus girl to sophisticated actress, portrayed as a natural display of innate intelligence. Yet MGM executives knew the truth. Studio records from 1925 listed her under special training needs due to limited education. Born Lucille LeSueur and raised in poverty, Crawford left school around age 12. Her intellectual growth was as carefully crafted as her screen persona. An MGM publicist later revealed she used note cards filled with classical music, literature, and art facts, not for genuine appreciation, but to appear knowledgeable at industry events. Her famed art collection was guided more by advisors seeking investment value and status than personal passion. She memorized talking points, leading to awkward moments, like a 1943 salon where she mistakenly discussed Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, published years later, before excusing herself. A former assistant said, "Joan didn't want to understand art, only to be seen as someone who did." This doesn't lessen Crawford's achievements. Her transformation took immense discipline and strategy, but her greatest performance wasn't on screen. It was the creation of the Joan Crawford persona, a carefully assembled cultural icon built through calculated image management. 14. Rex Harrison, the distinguished intellectual who left school at 16. Rex Harrison once told producers he couldn't play Professor Higgins in My Fair Lady because he knew nothing about linguistics or phonetics. Ironically, his most famous role required precisely that expertise, yet his refined persona masked a lack of formal education. Audiences assumed Harrison had attended elite British universities due to his commanding presence and flawless diction, an image he never corrected. In truth, he left school at 16 with no qualifications. His polished speech and intellectual manner came from years on stage, not academia. A wardrobe assistant recalled that when asked about George Bernard Shaw's politics during filming, Harrison dodged the question by demanding script changes, a typical way he avoided topics he didn't know. Director Anatole Litvak said Harrison didn't research roles through books but by observing how intellectuals spoke and behaved. He was an exceptionally gifted mimic, not a scholar. When performing Shakespeare, Harrison focused on perfecting sound and rhythm rather than understanding deeper meanings. A colleague noted he delivered lines beautifully without fully grasping the philosophy behind them. Harrison's true talent lay in convincingly embodying intellectualism, blurring the line between actor and role so thoroughly that audiences believed in his authenticity. 13. Vivien Leigh, the cultured aristocrat from Ordinary Beginnings. Vivien Leigh once joked, "I'm not a lady, I'm just a woman who plays them convincingly," a modest comment that was surprisingly accurate. Her delicate beauty and polished demeanor suggested aristocratic roots and high education, but the truth was quite different. Born Vivian Mary Hartley to middle-class parents, Leigh had no exceptional academic background. Her refined image was crafted through elocution lessons, deportment training, and deliberate imitation of upper-class manners. Studio contracts even required her to attend cultural events like museums and concerts to maintain this sophisticated facade. Director George Cukor noted how methodically she studied aristocratic behavior, how they held teacups or entered rooms, building her persona with precise detail. Though often pictured surrounded by classical books, many were props for photos. Her actual reading focused more on scripts and fashion magazines. Laurence Olivier, her husband, recognized this transformation as a remarkable act of self-invention. She created the perfect English rose from humble origins through sheer determination. Vivien Leigh's success wasn't born from privilege, but from relentless effort to craft and sustain a persona both on and off screen, making her a true master of reinvention. 12. James Mason, the Cambridge intellectual who studied architecture. James Mason once joked, "I'm often miscast in my own life. People assume I'm well-read because of how I speak, but I'm just good at speaking." His polished British accent and thoughtful roles created an image of academic distinction, reinforced by interviews full of literary and historical references. Publicity often cited his Cambridge education, suggesting a scholarly background. Though Mason did attend Cambridge, he studied architecture, not literature or classics, and was an unremarkable student more interested in acting than academics. A classmate recalled Mason attending lectures on poetry and philosophy, not out of genuine interest, but to mimic professors for future roles. His apparent erudition in interviews was mostly performance. Director Nicholas Ray noted Mason prepared for interviews as thoroughly as for roles, memorizing quotations and researching topics to appear spontaneous. Mason's literary knowledge was often superficial, focused more on scripts and contemporary fiction. A colleague said Mason could discuss books he hadn't read, confidently referencing classics without reading them fully. At a literary event, Mason praised Conrad's victory, but was gently corrected that his comments fit Lord Jim. Mason smoothly replied that Conrad's thematic unity made individual titles nearly interchangeable. Mason's sophisticated intellectual image was partly real, but largely a crafted performance. 11. Leslie Howard, the British intellectual who created a persona. In the 1930s and 40s, Leslie Howard was Hollywood's go-to for intellectual roles, known for his refined British persona in literary and historical films. His cultivated image suggested deep education and cultural sophistication, embodying the ideal British intellectual, thoughtful and erudite. However, Howard's real life differed greatly. A 1935 studio memo advised highlighting his literary interests while hiding his enthusiasm for boxing and racing, which clashed with his screen persona. Born Leslie Howard Steiner to Hungarian Jewish parents, his education was ordinary, and his polished British accent was carefully practiced, not inherited. Co-stars were often surprised by the contrast. Myrna Loy recalled expecting a scholarly poet, but instead meeting a man obsessed with sports and mechanics. Director Michael Powell noted Howard's focus on acting techniques over historical context, showing limited interest in the intellectual backdrop of his roles. During The Scarlet Pimpernel, Howard dismissed detailed history lessons, saying he only needed to know how aristocrats behaved on stage, not why they were in danger. His intellectual image was largely a crafted performance, not genuine scholarship. Howard's true talent was his ability to convincingly portray cultured intelligence, creating a lasting impression of sophistication that was more persona than reality. 10. George Sanders, the sophisticated polymath with a carefully cultivated act. George Sanders debuted in Strange Cargo, 1940, discussing Rousseau, embodying his trademark role, a cultured, cynical intellectual among lesser minds. His refined accent and world-wise demeanor suggested aristocratic education and international experience. However, a 20th Century Fox publicist once asked Sanders about his education. He replied, "Make something up that sounds impressive. The details don't matter." Born in Russia to British parents but raised in suburban England, Sanders had a typical education with no standout academic achievements. His sophisticated persona was carefully crafted through elocution lessons, cultural study, and mimicking upper-class mannerisms. Claims of fluency in 5 languages were exaggerated. He was mainly fluent in English, with basic French and a few memorized phrases in others. Director Alfred Hitchcock praised Sanders for creating the illusion of a cultured sophisticate without actually being one. Sanders himself admitted in a 1956 interview, "People are more impressed by the appearance of knowledge than knowledge itself." His preparation focused on surface details like brandy glass handling and perfect pronunciation, creating a convincing performance. The polished, worldly figure was largely a brilliant act, blurring the line between actor and role, with true intelligence rooted in mastering the art of illusion. 9. Vincent Price, the art expert with limited expertise. Vincent Price's cultured voice, often heard discussing fine wines, rare manuscripts, or Renaissance art, became as famous as his horror roles. His calm speech, cultural references, and apparent art knowledge suggested exceptional education and refinement. Publicity praised his art collection and Yale education, painting him as a Renaissance man whose intellect matched his acting. In 1962, Life magazine called Price Hollywood's most sophisticated art connoisseur, but failed to mention his home's paintings and sculptures were arranged by professional decorators for the photo shoot. Though Price attended Yale and studied art history at the Courtauld Institute, his expertise was narrower than publicized, focusing mainly on American and British art. Dealers recalled he knew enough to sound authoritative to novices, but deferred to experts when questioned. Price's famous art collection was largely assembled with professional help. Gallery owners noted he depended on consultants for selection and authentication. His enthusiasm was genuine, but his independent judgment was limited. In the early 1960s, Price partnered with Sears Roebuck to sell the Vincent Price collection of fine art. Though marketed as personally curated, professionals chose most pieces, with Price giving general approval. In 1977, Price admitted, "I'm not a scholar in either horror or art, just an enthusiast who sounds knowledgeable." His true talent was making art appreciation appealing to the general public without deep expertise. 8. Clifton Webb, the cultural elite, with a manufactured background. Clifton Webb once told director Otto Preminger that writing his autobiography would be difficult because he didn't know which version of his life to tell. This comment hinted at the carefully crafted image behind his polished aristocratic persona. Webb's refined speech and mannerisms, plus his portrayals of sophisticated characters, suggested a privileged upbringing and elite education. Studio biographies echoed this myth, describing him as descending from distinguished New England families and educated at private academies. In reality, Webb, born Webb Parmalee Hollenbeck in Indianapolis, came from a middle-class background with limited schooling and no college education. His mother, far from a society matron, was a determined stage mom who pushed his talents. Webb's transformation included changing his name and erasing any regional accent with dialect coaches. Etiquette lessons helped him master upper-class customs, which he memorized meticulously. Director Preminger noted Webb studied high society like an anthropologist rather than being born into it. A telling moment was when Webb corrected French pronunciation on set. Though his corrections were historically inaccurate, he delivered them confidently, never questioned. Webb famously said his background was whatever I need it to be for each role, showing his pragmatic approach to image building. His aristocratic screen persona was a self-made performance, a key to his success. 7. Basil Rathbone, the real-life Sherlock Holmes with average intellect. Basil Rathbone's famous line, "The game is afoot," sealed his identity as Sherlock Holmes, leading many to believe he shared the character's intellect. His sharp diction and commanding presence made audiences assume he had extraordinary mental abilities. Fan magazines fueled this myth, with headlines like "The Man Who is Sherlock Holmes" and stories claiming Rathbone applied Holmes's deductive skills in real life. In truth, Rathbone was a skilled actor with average intelligence who excelled at portraying intelligence. A wardrobe assistant recalled fans bringing him complex puzzles, only for Rathbone to defer to writers for answers. His performance relied on technical precision. Rehearsed gestures, darting glances, and well-timed delivery created the illusion of brilliance rather than genuine analysis. Director Roy William Neill noted Rathbone's effort to memorize scientific references without fully grasping them. Between takes, Rathbone preferred chatting about horse racing over solving crossword puzzles. Nigel Bruce, his Dr. Watson, joked that he often explained scientific terms to Rathbone, reversing public perception of their intellects. Rathbone himself admitted, "I don't solve mysteries. I simply play a man who does," highlighting the difference between acting smart and actually being so. 6. Myrna Loy, the perfect wife, intellectual from limited education. When the Harvard Lampoon called Myrna Loy the ideal wife in 1936, it reflected her portrayals of intelligent, witty women like Nora Charles in the Thin Man series. Her cultural ease and quick wit suggested natural refinement and education. However, Loy later said, "I just tried to speak properly and remember my lines," revealing her sophistication was deliberate. Born Myrna Williams in Montana, she ended formal schooling after high school. Her polished manner came from years of observation, reading, and self-improvement, not formal education. MGM's 1933 screen test noted her Western accent and recommended elocution training, which shaped her refined, cosmopolitan speech. Director Director W.S. Van Dyke said Loy carefully studied the speech and mannerisms of educated women, crafting her persona through observation. Off-screen, she kept a notebook of witty remarks and references to prepare for social events and interviews. For roles like In the Best Years of Our Lives, she focused on learning specific terms rather than broad knowledge, asking for glossaries with phonetic pronunciations. Changing her name from Williams to Loy marked her transformation from a small-town girl to a sophisticated star. Loy's intellectual image was largely self-made, built through determination and craft, rather than privilege or formal study. 5. Claude Rains, the cultured intellectual from London's slums. In Casablanca, Claude Rains embodied sophisticated corruption as Captain Renault, delivering lines like, "I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here," with such cultured precision that audiences assumed the actor must share his character's worldliness, if not his moral flexibility. Rains' impeccable diction, commanding presence, and facility with sophisticated dialogue created an impression of exceptional breeding and education. His cultured British accent and apparent ease with classical references reinforced this perception of natural refinement and academic achievement. This carefully constructed persona had remarkably little connection to Rains' actual background. London birth records tell the true story. Born to a poor family in London's Camberwell slums, he received minimal formal education, leaving school at age 11 to work. His father was an alcoholic stagehand, not the distinguished gentleman many assumed based on Rains' aristocratic manner. The transformation began with his voice. A childhood speech impediment left Rains with a lisp and difficulty pronouncing R sounds. Through rigorous training and practice, he not only overcame these challenges, but transformed his voice into his most distinctive professional asset. Herbert Beerbohm Tree, who discovered Rains, later remarked, "I've never witnessed such a complete reconstruction of natural speech patterns through sheer determination." Rains' linguistic journey included developing a nearly photographic memory for dialogue, a necessary adaptation for someone with limited reading skills. Unable to quickly process new scripts due to residual reading difficulties, Rains would have scripts read aloud to him, then memorize them completely, often after a single hearing. Director Michael Curtis, who worked with Rains on Casablanca, noted his methodical approach. Claude studied educated men, how they stood, how they held objects, how they listened. Nothing was accidental. He constructed his public persona through careful observation and endless practice. A wardrobe assistant from Warner Brothers recalled Rains' detailed attention to his image. Mr. Rains insisted on specific modifications to all his costumes. Higher collar stands to elongate his neck, slightly padded shoulders, precisely angled pocket squares. He understood that perceived sophistication came from 1,000 small details most people never consciously notice. The secret to playing distinguished men, Rains once told a young actor, is making the audience forget you were ever anything else. This revealing comment suggests Rains' awareness of the gap between his cultivated image and his humble origins. The seemingly aristocratic intellectual whom audiences admired was entirely self-created, a remarkable achievement by a man who transformed himself from an uneducated slum child to one of cinema's most distinguished presences. 4. David Niven, the witty raconteur who embellished his life. "Don't listen to a word I say," David Niven once told an interviewer with a wink. "I'm the biggest liar in Hollywood." The journalist laughed, assuming this was just another example of Niven's famous self-deprecating wit. It wasn't. Niven's elegant manner, seemingly effortless wit, and entertaining anecdotes created an impression of natural sophistication and worldly experience. His autobiographical books, filled with charming stories about Hollywood and international high society, reinforced his image as a debonair insider whose intelligence matched his charm. Niven seemed the embodiment of the sophisticated gentleman, educated, cultured, and unfailingly eloquent. While Niven did attend prestigious schools, Stowe and Sandhurst, his academic performance was unremarkable, and his intellectual interests were considerably narrower than his public image suggested. School records describe him as more interested in mischief than studies, and possessed of charm rather than scholarly ambition. His famous wit came less from natural brilliance than from a methodically developed repertoire of stories and jokes, many carefully rehearsed and refined over years of telling. Director Billy Wilder once observed Niven testing different versions of the same anecdote at various dinner parties, noting which phrasings generated the strongest reactions and incorporating them into the final version. A revealing behind-the-scenes moment occurred during filming of Around the World in 80 Days. Between takes, Niven entertained the crew with a story about his wartime exploits involving a daring escape from Nazi-occupied France. When a former military officer present quietly pointed out a historical inaccuracy in the tale, Niven smoothly incorporated the correction and continued without acknowledging the fabrication. education. Researchers have discovered that many of his most celebrated stories were significantly embellished or entirely fabricated. His autobiography, The Moon's a Balloon, contains numerous chronological impossibilities and encounters with people who weren't present at the claimed events. Peter Ustinov, himself a gifted storyteller, once remarked about Niven, "David elevated anecdotes to an art form where truth became merely optional. He wasn't dishonest so much as he was creating entertainment with himself as the central character in a lifelong performance." Even Niven's famous accent, the quintessential upper-class British tone, was partially constructed. Having spent his formative years in various locations and schools, Niven deliberately refined his speech to eliminate regional influences and emphasize aristocratic pronunciation patterns that enhanced his sophisticated image. "The truth," Niven once told a journalist who questioned one of his anecdotes, "should never interfere with a good story." This revealing comment suggests Niven's understanding that perceived sophistication often depends more on entertaining presentation than factual accuracy. 3. Ronald Colman, the Oxford scholar who never attended university. In 1942, a young actor approached Ronald Colman for advice about playing an educated character. "How did your Oxford education influence your approach to intellectual roles?" he asked. Colman smiled enigmatically and replied, "My dear boy, one needn't attend Oxford to play Oxford men convincingly." Few understood the literal truth behind this response. Colman's cultured accent, thoughtful demeanor, and facility with literary dialogue had created an impression of exceptional academic achievement. His performances as intellectuals, artists, and gentlemen suggested personal experience with the educated elite he portrayed. Studio biographies reinforced this perception through careful wording that implied prestigious education without making specific claims. Fan magazines frequently alluded to his scholarly background and literary knowledge, credentials that seemed evident in his articulate interviews and sophisticated screen presence. The reality? Colman never attended Oxford or any university. His formal education ended at boarding school, after which he worked as a clerk before beginning his acting career. His seemingly natural erudition was methodically developed through years of reading, speech training, and deliberate study of the upper classes he would later portray. Colman's famous voice, perfectly modulated and precisely articulated, was not an inheritance of privileged education, but the product of deliberate development. After being wounded in World War I, he used his convalescence to study elocution, systematically eliminating any regional accent and developing the mellifluous tones that would become his trademark. Director George Cukor, who worked with Colman on A Double Life, noted his methodical approach. Ronald studied educated men, their speech patterns, their mannerisms, their way of engaging with ideas. He constructed his intellectual persona through observation rather than academic experience. A telling incident occurred during filming of Lost Horizon, where Colman portrayed a diplomat. When author James Hilton visited the set and engaged Colman in a discussion of political history relevant to the character, Colman politely steered the conversation toward performance aspects of the role, avoiding the specific historical knowledge he had never acquired. His performance as poet Robert Browning in The Barretts of Wimpole Street was widely praised for its intellectual sensitivity, yet Colman admitted privately that he had read little of Browning's work beyond the script requirements. His preparation focused on capturing the poet's mannerisms and speaking style rather than understanding his literary significance. The seemingly natural scholar whom audiences admired was largely a creation, a brilliant performance by a talented actor who understood that perceived intellectualism enhanced his professional opportunities. 2. Greer Garson, the intellectual British lady with manufactured refinement. "I've played so many educated women that people assume I must have attended the finest schools," Greer Garson once remarked to a co-star. "In reality, I've simply learned to play educated women convincingly." Garson's refined accent, graceful manner, and apparent ease with intellectual material created an impression of aristocratic breeding and exceptional education. Her performances as cultured, articulate women in films like Mrs. Miniver and Random Harvest suggested personal experience with the educated elite she portrayed. Studio publicity manufactured an appropriately elevated background. MGM press releases described her as coming from a distinguished family with traditions of culture and education, implying aristocratic connections that didn't exist. Her father, described in publicity as a gentleman of means, was actually a modest clerk who died when she was young. While Garson did attend London University, not the more prestigious Oxford or Cambridge often assumed, her academic career was relatively ordinary, and her family background was solidly middle class rather than aristocratic. Her seemingly innate sophistication was carefully developed through elocution lessons, deportment training, and systematic study of upper-class mannerisms. A wardrobe memo from Pride and Prejudice reveals how thoroughly Garson's image was constructed. It specifies, "Miss this, Garson has requested higher necklines than historically accurate and gloves for all drawing room scenes. She believes these contribute to her lady of quality appearance. This attention to creating aristocratic impressions through costume choices reflected Garson's understanding that perceived sophistication depended on visual cues as much as dialogue or performance. Garson's intellectual interests were similarly curated for public consumption. A publicist who worked with her in the 1940s later recalled, Greer maintained two distinct libraries, the impressive leather-bound classics prominently displayed when photographers visited, and the mystery novels and fashion magazines she actually read when relaxing. The secret to playing brilliant women, Garson once told a young actress, is never revealing the effort behind the brilliance. This revealing comment suggests Garson's awareness of the gap between her cultivated image and the work required to create it. Particularly telling was MGM's transformation of her name and identity. Born Eileen Evelyn Greer Garson, the studio emphasized her middle names and constructed a more elevated background story that aligned with her screen persona, a conscious marketing strategy that Garson herself embraced and perpetuated. Her transformation from a middle-class London girl to the quintessence of British refinement represents one of Hollywood's most successful reinventions, a performance that continued seamlessly on and off screen throughout her distinguished career. 1. Laurence Olivier, the Shakespearean genius who struggled with text. Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. Hamlet's famous advice to the players might have been directed at Laurence Olivier himself, whose towering reputation as the greatest classical actor of his generation created an impression of exceptional intellectual depth and literary understanding. His definitive performances of Shakespeare's most complex characters suggested profound textual analysis and philosophical insight. Critics and scholars reinforce this perception, frequently describing Olivier's work as revealing new intellectual dimensions in familiar material, the product of a brilliant mind engaging with literary genius. Kenneth Tynan, perhaps the most influential theater critic of the era, perpetuated this image, writing that Olivier thinks Shakespeare's thoughts after him with unparalleled clarity. But behind closed doors at the National Theatre, a different story emerged. Director Peter Hall, who worked closely with Olivier, later revealed, Larry's genius wasn't intellectual, it was intuitive and physical. He didn't analyze Hamlet's existential crisis, he found a physical embodiment for it. When discussions became too abstract, he would grow frustrated and say, just tell me what he wants and I'll show you how he gets it. During rehearsals for Othello, a young actor asked Olivier about the philosophical implications of jealousy in the play. According to multiple witnesses, Olivier replied, I don't give a damn about the philosophy. I care about how jealousy makes a man move, sound, and look. This response reflected Olivier's fundamentally physical rather than intellectual approach to classical material. A particularly revealing incident occurred during preparation for King Lear. When literary advisors provided a scholarly analysis of the play's complex language, Olivier set it aside, saying, this means nothing to me. Show me an old man who's been betrayed, and I'll show you Lear. His approach to the role focused on studying elderly men's physical movements, rather than the